Black House, while containing plenty of the fantasy elements of its predecessor, The Talisman, is predominantly a horror thriller story. In Black House, Stephen King and Peter Straub revisit the territories and the protagonist of The Talisman, Jack Sawyer, but this time around the two authors are more interested in themes of possession by evil spirits, one truly diabolical real-life serial killer, and in returning to their roots to tell a tense, slow-burn terrifier. Oh, and they challenge the stereotype that motorcyclists are all a bunch of big, dumb, idiot assholes, which, as a writer, I genuinely appreciate. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. This is the second and final video in my series for The Talisman. Last week I discussed the 1984 novel as well as the incomplete 2009 comic book series, and today I'll be taking a look at the sequel to The Talisman, Black House, which was published in 2001. This is my badass biker dude costume, complete with 1989 Cinderella tour t-shirt. This is authentic. This is almost as old as I am. But anyway, for anyone who has read the book, this will make sense. And I will get to the Black House biker gang, otherwise known as the Thunder Five, soon enough. But first, let's talk about the story and how it came to be. Black House, a brief summary. In this sequel to The Talisman, Jack Sawyer is now in his late 30s and has taken an early retirement from the LAPD, retreating to a small town in Wisconsin. He has no memory of his adventures as a 12-year-old boy when he traveled into a parallel universe in search of the talisman that would save his mother's life. When a series of gruesome murders occurs in western Wisconsin that are reminiscent of those committed several decades earlier by a real-life madman, the killer is dubbed the Fisherman, and Jack's buddy, the local chief of police, begs Jack to help his inexperienced force find him. But is this merely the work of a disturbed individual, or has a mysterious and malignant force been unleashed in this quiet town? What causes Jack's inexplicable waking dreams? If that is what they are, it's almost as if someone is trying to tell him something. As that message becomes increasingly impossible to ignore, Jack is drawn back to the territories and to his own hidden past, where he may find the sole strength to enter a terrifying house at the end of a deserted tract of forest, there to encounter the obscene and ferocious evils sheltered within. History and background. As I discussed in my video for The Talisman, King and Straub met in London, where they first discussed collaborating, but it wasn't until a few years later that the team up, which would result in The Talisman, came to fruition, following Straub's move to the United States. Turns out Straub is actually from Wisconsin originally, which is where Black House takes place, and not from London. I thought he was from London because he lived there when he met King, but Straub is not a cheeky English bloke and is in fact a cheesehead. I honestly couldn't find anything in regards to how or why King and Straub decided to write this book after almost 2 decades had passed since The Talisman, but I'm glad they did. Much like Dr. Sleep, as a constant reader, it was cool to revisit a familiar character after all that time had passed and to get a glimpse into the life the character had led between the books. Honestly, I'm hoping King does something similar to this with Abra, the powerful young girl from Dr. Sleep, but I mean, the man's not getting any younger, so if that iron isn't presently in the fire, I don't know that there would be enough time, and I don't even want to think about that. Anyway, it seems as if the two authors might have made a conscious effort to give their fans what they wanted and more of what they had initially expected from the Talisman. In Black House, King and Straub upped the horror vibes and nightmare fuel themes, threw in a healthy dose of Dark Tower tie-ins for good measure, and wrote a story that had the ability to appeal to both horror and fantasy fans alike. There was a deliberate effort made to spice things up. And what better way to spice things up than to include one of the most notorious monsters in American history? Content warning. The following section contains discussion of disturbing, real-life atrocities that are not for the faint of heart. If this is too much for you, skip ahead to the time code below. The Fisherman. There are a lot of horrible topics coming up, and in an effort to not upset the YouTube overlords, I will be replacing some of the more offensive or upsetting terms with sound-alike words and workarounds, but I'm sure you won't need me to spell it out for you in order for you to get the meaning. The villain in Black House, Charles Burnside, is just a man, or at least he was just a man, and an evil, miserable old bastard at that. However, Burnside is no longer alone in his own body, and he has been possessed by the spirit of someone or something far more sinister, far more wicked than Burnside had ever aspired to be. Early on, long before Burnside is found out, the officers investigating his string of grisly crimes begin to notice some inexplicable, disturbing similarities to another well-known serial killer whose laundry list of crimes and sadistic acts goes well beyond anything as basic as murder. They believe they may have a copycat killer on their hands, but this is no copycat. Rather, he is in a significant way the genuine article, the original bloodthirsty monster. Burnside is only Burnside sometimes, and when he isn't Burnside, he is the Fisherman, and the Fisherman is none other than Albert Fish. Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870. Fish was born into a family with a history of mental illness, and after his father passed away when Albert was only 5 years old, his mother sent him away to an orphanage when she was no longer able to afford to feed and take care of him. At the orphanage, Fish was subjected to frequent abuse. Fish and the other wards of the orphanage were mercilessly whipped and beaten, and Fish claimed that he began to enjoy the pain of these beatings. At age 12, Fish's mother was able to take him back from the orphanage, and it was around this time that he began experimenting with urolagnia and coprophagia, which are the practice of drinking urine and eating feces, respectively. Throughout his teenage years, Fish would begin visiting public baths, which he would start to watch and covet undressed boys, and this is when his interest in children seems to have begun. After moving to New York City at the age of 20, Fish became a prostitute and began taking advantage of young boys. While he eventually married and had 6 children, he continued with his extracurricular interests with children. During this time, Fish would take men as lovers, and in one particular instance, things began to take a masochistic turn. According to Fish in his confession, he bound and tortured a man for 2 weeks, which ended with Fish severing the man's, and essentially leaving him for dead. Eventually, his wife left him, a good move on her part, but she left Fish with all of the kids, which was decidedly not a good move. It was around this time that Fish began to experience auditory hallucinations, something his mother had suffered from as well, and Fish also began experimenting with and indulging in self-harm. One of the most notorious facts about Fish is that when he was arrested, x-rays showed that he had been inserting needles into his groin and pelvic region. In total, 29 needles were discovered lodged in Fish's region. Additionally, he hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle, which he also encouraged his kids and their friends to do. And he inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his ass and set it on fire. It pains me to say this, but this is when Albert Fish's behavior escalates. I'll spare you the details, as there are many, all of which are increasingly unpleasant, but suffice it to say, Fish's interest in children intensified, his tastes evolved, and he began to believe that God was commanding him to torture and do a number of unspeakable things to children, the most egregious of which was cannibalism. In Black House, King and Straub use Burnside as a vehicle for evil, as a means for Fish to commit his heinous acts. However, Fish is in cahoots with and working in service of a power far more substantial and far more destructive than even Fish could ever hope to aspire to. And that destructive force has intentions far more nefarious than anything Fish could have ever dreamt up, if you can believe that. If you want to know more about Albert Fish, there are plenty of documentaries out there, one of which I have linked in the description below. But me, I've had enough of Albert Fish for the time being, and I'm tapping out. The Thunder 5. This is going to be a short segment that I wanted to throw in here out of appreciation for King and Straub's portrayal of the motorcycle gang in Black House, The Thunder 5. And perhaps as a way to lighten the mood after that total bummer Albert Fish stuff. While the authors initially give us the impression that the Thunder 5 are a bunch of stereotypical troublemaking hooligans, we come to see that they are in fact a crew of smart, good-hearted, courageous guys. There's a stigma that comes with being a motorcyclist in the United States, and I'm not saying the stereotype of bikers in the United States being a loud, obnoxious bunch of violent dipshits isn't at least partially true. But most of the time we're just friends who love to ride and spend time with our fellow riders out on the open road. It's not all sons of anarchy. It's not all sons of anarchy out here or anything. That show is a caricature. Though I'm sure there are violent arms-dealing biker gangs out there, most of us couldn't be further removed from that lifestyle. This is me with my two best friends / bandmates, and while we may be dipshits, we're just a trio of silly sweethearts who would never hurt a fly. We're not bullies, we don't harass women, we don't rev our engines at stoplights and annoy the folks in our neighborhoods. We just love to ride and have fun. This is my bike. He is a 2020 Kawasaki Vulcan S, and his name is Kevin. Kevin is from Japan, and he likes long rides in the mountains, seeking out old 1950s style diners and premium non-ethanol fuel. Final thoughts. I liked Black House quite a bit. It was more my speed than the Talisman, and even with its fantasy tie-ins to the Talisman and the Dark Tower, it managed to keep me reading with a diverse cast of mostly likable characters and its gruesomely twisted plot. There are rumors that a third Talisman novel may see publication in the future, but it's hard to say whether or not that is coming from reliable sources, or if it's just hearsay and wishful thinking. However, some have surmised that King's upcoming novel, Fairy Tale, may have ties to the Talisman, Black House, and the Dark Tower. But when it comes to Stephen King, these sorts of tie-ins and callbacks are becoming a regular part of King's writing. They're par for the course rather than unexpected surprises these days. All things serve the beam and all that. Next week I will be getting started on the Thinner series. Thinner was King's 5th publication, writing as Richard Bachman, and while the first 4 Bachman books were decidedly different from the majority of King's output under his own name, Thinner is the first time that the lines between Bachman and King really began to blur. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so pour some sugar on me. and hit the subscriber bell so you get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with Blood and Guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.